This is Brent Allen Winters, commonlawyer.com, www.commonlawyer.com, and this is a Common Lawyer comments concerning our common law, our law of the land, as it is compared and contrasted with its ever-present antagonist on every continent and in every age. And this law of the land, common law, also called due process, also called anciently the Volkrecht, this common law goes back so many centuries, it's lost in the fog of antiquity, but as we move forward, we find documents where people have recorded the principles of our common law, and those are the solid stepping stones as you move through history, moving forward up until the Constitution of the United States. And our Constitution of the United States is arguably the best evidence of our common law as it is applied to limit government. And that's a thin slice of our common law. Our common law covers everything. This is just the common law applied to limit government, to govern the government. That's what this Constitution of the United States is for, to govern the government. Individually, in individual instances, when they come after you, when the government tries to serve a search warrant and toss your house, the Fourth Amendment is there to what? To limit government. When they torture a man or woman, try to make them talk, separate them from their families, put them in jail. Don't let them go to their wife's funeral, as they did to the governor of Illinois. Wouldn't let him attend his wife's funeral when he was in prison. That's torture, friends. Not be with your family. He didn't need to go to his wife's funeral to be with his wife. She's gone. But he did need to go as a father to be with his 6 children. God demands those kind of things. And those people that mitigate against, refuse to be governed by the principles of our common law of government, will pay a horrible price. Rest assured, they'll pay a horrible price, maybe in this life, maybe in the judgment to come, but they will pay a horrible price. Let's go to the common Catechism of our Constitution by Arthur J. Stansbury, publishers Hillary Gray, Little and Wilkins, 18 and 28. We got question 23 in this catechism of 333 questions. Question. Let's go to 24. I think that's the one. What do you mean by Americans obeying the laws of England before our separation from England? I mean that England, was compelled to consent to the colony's resistance against unlawful laws, and should after that have liberty to make laws for themselves and obey England no more. Now don't forget, America had made laws for herself for the reigns of George I during his reign, and the reign of his son, George II, and now they were into the reign of his grandson, George III. Remember, those 3 men were Germans. They weren't Englishmen. Well, of course, Englishmen are a mixture of Germanic tribes. The Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, which are the Danes, and then mix in the Celts with that. But George I, George II, and George III, who was king way up until into the 1800s, but he was the king during this war we had with Britain. They were Germans. Why did they have a German king? Because they couldn't find anybody in England or Scotland or Wales who they're comfortable with that was a Protestant. And there's still one non-negotiable requirement to hold the crown of Britain. What is it? This is non-negotiable. Still, it's the only one that's non-negotiable. That says you got to be a Protestant. You can't be a Romanist. You can't be somebody who kisses the Pope's foot. They won't allow that. Why? It's a violation of the sovereignty of the country. That's why. Isn't that simple? I mean, anybody, I asked a fellow one time, he was in a coffee shop at home and he was in town going to school. And I said, he's a Romanist. I said, would you kiss the Pope's foot? And he said, well, I reckon. I said, but why? And he didn't know what to say, but he shrugged his shoulders and he said, because he's the Pope. I said, well, no respectable man would lick another man's boots. Do you agree with that? Well, yeah. Then why would you do that? I keep trying to come back to the senselessness of what he was saying. But people, when it comes to religion, are duped and deluded. Why? Because the Bible says they haven't been given the love of the truth. Now, there's more to that statement than we can talk about now, but the reason people vote for evil people in government, and I don't mean bad people, everybody's bad, nobody's perfect. Donald Trump's not, he's not what? He's not the Messiah, he's not a paragon of virtue, but neither are you and neither am I. But there are those men that are right-headed and there are those men that are wrong-headed. I'm right-headed. That doesn't mean I don't take frolics and do things that are stupid and set myself back. I do. I try not to, but I do. But the grand difference between the Christian man and the non-Christian man is one's nose is pointed in this direction and the other's nose is pointed 180 degrees in this direction. It's not that they don't see eye to eye. No. That has nothing to do with it. No, they're looking in opposite directions. The world, the non-Christian world, is not looking in my direction, not walking in my direction. Every one of their noses is pointing in the other direction. And the word righteousness in the Bible is short for an old word, right-headedness. That's the word, the old word. William Tyndale invented the word righteousness because he thought right-headedness had too many syllables, was too cumbersome for his translation of the Bible into English. He was the first man to do it from the original tongues. But just remember, when you see the word righteousness in the Bible, it means you got your nose pointed in the right direction. You're right-headed. You're headed in the right way. Had a horse when I was growing up. Fat-bellied pony. I say pony, kind of like a Mustang pony, kind of half horse, half pony. It wasn't a great big animal, but it wasn't a little tiny Shetland pony. It was we just called it a pony. Round-bellied, pretty nice old gal. In the wintertime, I'd just throw 2 halters on her because I didn't have, it was just easy to do. And then I had a lead rope on both sides like reins. So I had 2 halters on her face and I'd just leap aboard. No saddle, no blanket. And I'd hold on to her mane here. And then away I'd go back on the Baker place to bring the cows up. And it was, say, it'd be a half mile, then another. It's about a mile back there. Baker place was just beyond ours. We called it the Baker because my granddad leased that place for decades from Mrs. Baker. She was a widower woman that lived south of us. Well, I get started on that pony, that round-bellied pony, and she'd try to turn her head around so she walked back to the barn. It was cold. She wanted to go back in the barn. Well, I'd pull her around this way, and then she'd get her head headed in the right direction again. And then she'd go off this side, and she'd try to go back this way. Then I'd pull her back this way. Finally, when I got far enough away, about a quarter mile from the barn, then she was okay, and away we went. But it was, I was warm sitting on her back without a saddle. That was the reason I did that. It kept me warm, all that body heat coming out of her. But it took me a while to get her right-headed. And that's the way most Christian folk are. They have a propensity to go right-headed, but they take frolics, they turn their head sideways, and the bit, God's got the bit in the mouth, and he'll jerk you back. That's the difference between us and them. They've got no bridle on. They got no halter on. God is not controlling them. The Spirit of God doesn't live in them. They're wrong-headed, and they're headed for hell. In the meantime, we all suffer. That's the hard thing about it. Now, God doesn't explain why he always allows that, but there's no question about it, he does. Well, question number 25. When we speak of this war with England, our war for separation from England. What do we call it? And we said we call it the American Revolution. And I said, but it wasn't a revolution. Revolution was invented in the 10th century. That's the 1100s. Or the 11th century, that's the 1000s. Which is it? You tell me. But it was in the 1000s. That'd be the 11th century. Harold Berryman, professor of law at Harvard, they threw him out of there. He was too conservative for him. He went to Emory down in Georgia. And he wrote a book called Law and Revolution, and he identifies the modern concept of revolution with what he calls the papal revolution of the 11th century, papal. And that's truly where bureaucracy was invented in a meaningful modern way. Corporations were invented in a meaningful modern way. This is according to Harold Berryman. I have no reason to believe he's not right. I read his book several times, big, thick book. The law of the city was established, the canon civil laws of Rome, because the Pope found the Code of Justinian, the Code of the Roman Empire. Well, they found it in a battle and brought it to him. He said, this is exactly what I need. It justifies my power. And by the way, that code is exactly what Bismarck used in Germany to justify what he was doing during World War I. And that's the same code that Adolf Hitler used to justify his ultimate power in Germany. They just tweaked it a little and called it the Code of Bismarck. That's what Napoleon used, that code, that Roman Code of Justinian, to justify his dictatorship in France. That code, same code. That's what Japan adopted in the 20th century to justify their atrocities, to try to conquer all the world, starting with the Far East. They used that German code, the Code of Bismarck, which is the Code of Justinian. That's what every communist country in the world has used and is still using. China, North Korea, they're using some form of that Code of Justinian. Remember, in the beginning I said there are only two options for religion, law, and government in the world. There never have been any more than two, and there never will be. Either the law of the land or common law tradition of government. Separation of powers, right to remain silent, right to keep and bear arms, duty to keep and bear arms, those are all duties, etc. And then the law of the city. The law of the city in modern times has been expressed in the Code of Justinian, the Roman Emperor, the canon civil laws of Rome. If you go to South America today and go to university there, you get a degree. There's a degree you get called degree doctor of the civil canon laws of Rome. Civil, that means city law. Civil canon laws of Rome. It's a dual degree because it's the same code fundamentally. All the dictatorships of the world have used that code. There are some that have used the principles of it without citing the code, but still, Islam does that. We're not that way. We're a common law country. And our Constitution of the United States has made that pretty strong here. Good thing we wrote it down. Remember I said the law of the land is unwritten, lex non scripta. But sometimes we write it down, and then we have those solid stepping stones through history. Our Constitution of the United States is among arguably the greatest, the clearest, as our common law is applied to limit government. See, our common law covers everything, and common law government is just one thin slice. Chapter, question. This is a catechism. Questions and answers that students are to learn. He says a revolution means some great change of government, and we ought ever to remember ours with ardent gratitude to God for so great a blessing, and with lasting love and reverence for those good, wise, and brave men who went through such dangers and sufferings that their country might be free. What is the greatest blessing America has? What is it? Well, I interviewed my mother and father for over 20 hours and wrote down their answers to questions. They're up pushing 100 years old now. I wanted to get down on paper what it was they believed. And I asked them, what's the most important thing you want to leave your children and grandchildren? I asked Mom first. I didn't want to ask Dad first, so I thought it would influence Mom's answer, my mother's answer. So I asked Mom first. And my mother said, the most important thing we can give to our children and grandchildren is the Bible, a love of the Bible. I said, what about this farmland? Well, yeah, that's important, but that's not the most important thing because the land doesn't mean nothing without the Bible. You don't even know what to do with it. You don't know why you've got it. You don't know what God has given to you. God has given us a land. As Americans, we live in our land. And to understand what that land means, the Bible is necessary. That has been ignored entirely. Entirely, almost. With very few exceptions. Since the earliest days of our country. But the people that came here understood that, and they understood that their relationship to their Maker was defined with their relationship to the land the Lord their God had given them. We want to talk about those kind of things. Well, sufferings of a continental soldier. He talks about that here. Question number 27. When and where did the war of the revolution, I don't like the word revolution, I'd said a revolution, the papal revolution is the father of all the communist revolutions, all the South American revolutions, all of them. And they're done on the same fashion according to Harold Berriman. And I see that. What happened in America is not a revolution, and that was his point too. No, a revolution, he cites this and points it out in every case. A revolution is founded upon vengeance for what has happened in the past. Vengeance for what has happened in the past. What happened here in America was not about vengeance for what had happened in the past. Had England done some nasty things? Read the Declaration of 76. It's all there. They've ravaged our coast. They've burnt our cities. They have stirred up the merciless savages against us who make no distinction, it says, between age, infirmity, or sex. Little babies, women, aged old men and women that are crippled, they slaughter them because you stirred them up to do it. You gave them whiskey and guns. Well, that's what they were doing. I'm just making the point. They were ravaging our towns. They even had in their plans to send clothing to America that carried the smallpox infection, to infect the white population by sending it clothing with African slaves. This is the history, friends. With African slaves that had the smallpox to America to start a pandemic in America. You think germ warfare is something new? The British were deep in plans of doing that to the colonies. They were that mad. Not to mention all the other things that our Declaration of 76 mentions. Did you know that it got so bad and the threat was so real that George Washington said to his Continental Army, he said, there weren't that many of them, a couple thousand at the most. Look, we could lose the whole country, but if we lose the army, the country is lost. But as long as we have the army, the country won't be lost. And he said, we got this newfangled thing called a vaccination, a smallpox vaccination. And if you volunteer to take it, then, and you live, and their chances of living, frankly, were pretty slim. Oh, I mean, you had better than a 50% chance, but a lot of people died because they didn't know at that time, it was brand new, they didn't know how much to administer and how to regulate it. And they would administer it in such a way that that the person getting vaccinated would get the smallpox and die. So he asked the Continental Army to get the vaccination. He said, and this was the prediction. Now it's coming to me. I think they predicted that 10% of the people, of the men that were vaccinated, would die. That was the prognostication. You know what happened? You talk about the sufferings of Continental soldiers. They volunteered to take the vaccination. And even though those that didn't die, they couldn't regulate the amount, they would become scabbed all over their bodies. And so he took a third of the army. He did it in sections. He didn't want his whole army down to where they couldn't fight at the same time. So he divided them up and had they vaccinated at different times and took turns. And when it came your turn to get vaccinated, you knew you were going to have scabs all over your body. And so he gave them, or they somehow got a hold of sulfur and some other things, and they would get out in the water. It was in the summertime, and they would rub each other's backs where all the scabs were in their fronts with sulfur. These are just boys, Lest we forget, were there sufferings? You bet there were sufferings. Men were being shot and killed, murdered, hung. And then the smallpox vaccination and try to stop the British from using germ warfare and wiping out they didn't care about the red man population or the African slave population. They wanted to destroy their own brothers in consanguinity, their own blood relatives, the white folk that were here, the English speaking people. It was brutal, friends, very brutal. And are we willing to throw all that away and be a bunch of perverts? No. Maybe almost half the country is. Look at the vote. Pretty sick, isn't it? This is down and dirty. I don't know what God's going to do, but it's going to take some pretty serious convictions to make that. Did they have convictions? Hey, do you have convictions? They did. People that started the country had convictions, some of them anyway. Do you? I'm not talking about preferences. I'm talking about something that somebody would say to you and say, are you going to change? And you say, no, I'm not changing. And they put a gun to your head, loaded and cocked, and they say, now are you ready to change? And you say, no, I ain't changing. Or they put a gun to the head of your wife or your children. This is what our Supreme Court has defined, Yoder versus Wisconsin, as a conviction. A conviction is that which does not change no matter what. And if you have that conviction, then you're entitled to the protections our common law has for us. That's the point. That's the point.